So thank you everyone for joining, and welcome to Babel's panel event, where we'll be discussing how to harness virtual events to engage with customers, prospects, and the media. When we talk about virtual events, we're going to specifically be looking at virtual industry events and media events, such as press conferences and media roundtables. To introduce you to myself briefly, my name is Katie Finn. I'm an Associate Director at Babel, and I'll be your chair for today's discussion. So we have some brilliant speakers on the line. We are joined today by Zoe Kleinman, tech reporter for the BBC, the world's leading public service broadcaster. We have Martin Landy, tech correspondent for PA Media, formerly Press Association, the national news agency for the UK and Ireland. Derek Weeks, Vice President of Sonatype and co-founder of All Day DevOps, one of the world's largest virtual conferences, which last year attracted nearly 40,000 attendees. And we have Babel's own Jenny Mowat, our Managing Director, who has over 14 years experience leading successful communications campaigns for technology brands. Now, before we dive into the discussion, I'd like to kick things off with a quick poll. So hopefully in a moment you should see a poll pop up on your screen, and we would like to know, have you hosted a virtual event, or do you plan to in the next 6 months? If you could just be marking your answers now, that would be brilliant. Okay. So as we can see from that, a huge 93% of you have or plan to host a virtual event, which I think is huge testament to how important virtual events have become to the technology industry, and is part of the reason why we wanted to hold this event today. Just to very briefly give you a bit of introduction to Babel and who we are. Babel is a specialist technology and telecoms PR agency. We've long described ourselves as communicators for brands within the digital economy. And in our current climate, it's become clear just how digital our economy is. We've seen everything become digital, from fitness classes to church services, and industry and media events are no exception. But virtual events present different challenges and different opportunities from their physical counterparts. One of the challenges that we hear technology professionals talk about particularly is that challenge of engagement. How can you engage your customers, your prospects, and the media with a virtual event in the same way as you would a physical event? And so that's why we wanted to host this discussion today, to really delve deeper into that discussion, look beyond the webinar and see how we can harness virtual events to engage the market and the media. So that's a little bit about who we are and why we're here. Just a couple of points of note before we begin. We will be allocating 15 minutes for questions at the end for our panel. Please do type those in the Q&A function in the chat. We'd love to hear from you, and we will get to as many as we can at the end. If you do have any sound issues, there are dial-ins with the markers that you should have received. There's also Babel team members lurking on the line who can point you in the direction of those dial-ins should you need them. You'll see on a number of our slides, we've used the hashtag Babel Talks virtual events. We do encourage you to be tweeting or posting on LinkedIn about the event. We'd love to get your responses. We're also going to be developing a white paper, delving a little bit deeper into some of these insights that we shared during today's conversation and looking at how companies can successfully harness virtual events. We'll share that with you together with a recording. Please do keep your eyes peeled for that. And lastly, if you would like to speak to Babel about how to optimize your virtual event to drive engagement, or to speak to us about how to prepare your speakers for virtual events, whether by a media training or presentation training, or if you'd just like to speak to Babel about how to drive market visibility of your brand through positive media coverage, please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. And so, without further ado, let me hand over to our panelists. So first of all, Derek, So when you launched All Day DevOps 5 years ago, why did you decide to make the event virtual and not physical?
Yeah, so thanks, Katie. It's first of all, thanks to Babel for pulling this discussion together, because I think it's a valuable one that we can all take lessons from throughout the discussion today. So if I think about 5 years ago when we started All Day DevOps and this virtual event idea, of course, we didn't have a global pandemic on our hands at that time. Some people have said we actually started virtual conferences before virtual conferences were a cool thing. But the real reason behind this, there were a couple of reasons. I used to go to a lot of conferences in the DevOps part of the IT industry. I probably go to 20 or 25 conferences a year. And often I would meet a group of people, so, say 3 people from Lloyd's of London, and I'm talking to them about their DevOps experience, their DevOps practices. And I'd say, well, you know, how many of your colleagues are here at the conference? They'd say, oh, there's just the 3 of us. And I'd say, well, how many are back at the office? And they'd say, oh, well, we have about 600 people in our DevOps practice. And there was really this disconnect of accessibility for the broader community to participate in these events. As I went to these, 20, 25 DevOps conferences a year, I would meet the same speakers. I would meet a lot of people in the same communities, but I realized that either there were more people from their company that were not able to attend and participate, or there were people in such remote work locations that these kind of bigger conferences and the knowledge shared at those just weren't accessible. So there happened to be enough momentum in our space of the market with a lot of conferences going on that were physical. They were held at the national, international, as well as regional and local levels. And I thought there's enough momentum that I think we can bring a conference to the world and make it completely accessible. So really, focusing on inclusivity from the beginning. Make it available to everyone, make it free, make it worldwide, put it on the internet, and remove all those barriers from such a conference.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point, and certainly one of the key advantages of that virtual model, where you can really democratize the access to education. And so then, what planning strategies would you recommend for other people thinking about launching their own virtual event, and what goes into planning All Day DevOps?
There's a lot that goes into it, and I think we planned this event. So as you mentioned at the beginning, last year we had about 40,000 people participate in this industry-wide event. We run the event for one day for a solid 24 hours. We have 5 tracks. We have over 150 speakers. We have a band of probably 50 or so volunteers from across the community, perhaps even more that are playing into the conference. But I think from a planning perspective, in approaching virtual events, you really need to look at what we sometimes refer as a 60-160 strategy. In the case of All Day DevOps, is kind of a 360 strategy. And that is, what are you doing the 60 days before the event, or the 365 days before the event? What's happening day of, and then what's happening post-conference? So you have to think about the production value of what are you producing? What are the goals of what you're producing? And I think most importantly, what kind of experience are you producing for your attendees? It's not just hosting a webinar. You almost have to think about it as hosting a community event, or hosting a television show with lots of interaction capabilities. So you really need to think about building an experience versus building a webinar that's kind of everyone's equivalent to a virtual event. But I think to do them well, you need to think about more of that experience overall. Then during the conference, you need to think about, it's not only the content like this that we're sharing here, but how do you provide the interactivity for the attendees? Because that's the distinct thing that you're going to miss from a physical event. And then afterwards, if there's a plan within your virtual event strategy to engage, how are you engaging people afterwards? So just as you guys are saying, we're going to produce a white paper from this conversation and share it with everyone. That's one of the end steps of the 6160 strategy of the following 60 days from the event. What happens? How does that engagement work? And I think that's part of the overall planning strategy that we certainly use and kind of think about to organize our time.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and one that leads on very nicely to that question regarding engagement. Perhaps it might be a good opportunity to talk a little bit more about some of the tactics that All Day DevOps employs to really be driving that dialogue.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think a really important one for anyone that's planning a virtual conference. When we started All Day DevOps 5 years ago, and we had lots of friends across the industry who organized conferences that were the local, regional, national conferences. And we said, hey, we have this idea. We're going to take a DevOps conference and we're going to put it online and make it completely accessible. Do you want to come in on the planning team and help us do this? Because you have conference building experience. And they said, no, that's totally going to fail. And it's totally going to fail because there's no hallway track. And the hallway track is outside of the presentations. When people watch a presentation and then leave, you get to talk to other attendees, other community members. And if you don't have that at your conference, then it's going to fail. And so from the very beginning, we knew that we needed to solve this problem. And one of the things that we did with this in our format is we have a Slack workspace. A lot of people use Slack as an instant messaging platform. And really, you could use any platform. It doesn't have to be Slack. But we gave all attendees the opportunity to join into a Slack channel. It gives the attendees a chance to meet each other. All of our speakers go from the conference into the Slack channel to answer questions immediately after the conversation. And the really important thing about that, because a lot of platforms that you can use, with Zoom, YouTube, whatever, have a chat function in the platform. But the thing about the chat platforms that's specific to Slack and other external platforms is the persistence of that. So even though All Day DevOps as a conference, we had a spring version, we also had which was in April, we had one, the big conference in November. That Slack workspace is still there. People still speak in it every day. People still connect in it every day. And that persistence is part of our 6160 strategy. And it's also part of keeping the community engaged and giving them value. It's like, where do I find the speaker slides? They're right there. Where do I find that speaker? They're right there. Where do I look to for advice? This community is right here. So that's accessible even when the conference is not running. That persistence of communication is available in that format.
I think that's such a fantastic example of really creating that two-way dialogue and making an event about so much more than just broadcasting.
Yeah, and I should say, from the very beginning, there was Mark Miller, who's the other co-founder of All Day DevOps. He's like, this isn't going to work. This Slack channel, it's a hokey idea. I don't know that anyone's going to use it. And from day one, it was successful. I think beyond our expectations. So we tracked about 100,000 conversations in our Slack workspace during the day of the conference. It is very much used. People share pictures from all over the world, files, they share code. So it's really a great way to interact that we have proven works year after year.
And so, as we said earlier, last year, All Day DevOps attracted nearly 40,000 attendees, which I think is a phenomenal achievement for any event, in particular a virtual event. What would you say is the secret to its success?
I think the key thing is inclusivity. There are a lot of people that we talk to about how do you host a virtual conference and put it out there? And they say, I have a DevOps group in London, or a communications team in London, or I'm doing this event for this group that in community that I have in Texas. And I said, you realize you're on the internet, right? And that literally anyone in the world, I saw one of our attendees this morning is in Illinois in the United States. So she's even an hour before me in time zone. You're open to everyone. And I think that's part of the inclusivity of the event. The other things that we've done are we've really involved our community in how we run the event. So one of my favorite stories is we have a rule of yes around our conference. So my friend now, Sumit Agarwal, who was at Broadridge, still is at Broadridge Financial Services, we were having dinner one night in London, and he said, what would make All Day DevOps really great? You need a cultural transformation track, because that's really missing from the agenda. And I was like, that is an awesome idea. And if you lead that track, we can add that to the agenda. And it was always this idea of anyone can bring any idea if they also want to contribute to that. So we let people experiment with our conference platform. And if it works, we bring it back. And since year 2, we've had a cultural transformation track, and Sumit still leads that track to this day. So that's part of engaging the community. The other thing that I think is really different about the way we structured All Day DevOps and how it's attracted so many people is we say, like a physical conference, and this is of course pre-COVID giving these recommendations, but like a physical conference, attend with your colleagues. Don't just register alone. If you're going to attend a physical conference, you watch a session, you leave the session, you have lunch with your colleagues, you discuss, well, what did we learn? What did we hear? Should we do those types of things? And bringing that experience into the virtual space, we tell everyone as we're promoting it, register yourself, register your team, attend together. We had over 180 viewing parties that we call them, where different communities were hosting parties either at their companies or open to the public in their regional locations. So we get a massive amount of people participating in the conference, but we also have these, while we're virtual, we have live satellite conferences, if you will, or viewing parties throughout. So I think that makes a big part of it. The last thing I'll leave you with is just know what your measures of success are at the beginning of the day. Are you trying to generate leads? Are you trying to generate brand awareness? Are you just offering education to the community overall? What are your goals, and be very clear about those up front and build the platform that helps you to attain those goals.
That's some really, really fantastic advice. Thank you, Derek. So to talk then from a media perspective, so Zoe, I know when we spoke ahead of this discussion, you mentioned you don't tend to attend too many physical or virtual events. I mean, what does make you really want to attend a virtual event?
I think the bar is really very high for us, because we get invited to a lot of these things all the time. And, as a working journalist, my job is to find stories. And I think there's got to be something in it that I think I might either be able to turn into a story, or something that will really inform my thinking on a story that I'm working on. So, for example, we're doing a lot on contact tracing apps at the moment, for tracing the pandemic. And so if there was an event that was specifically about that, and there was some sort of insight that I thought I might not have heard elsewhere, it might not make a story for me at this time, but it might feed into something I do in the future, then I'd be tempted to go along or to have a listen. I think timing is everything. And again, like, I can only speak for myself, but I'm often at my busiest in the mornings. So breakfast things, mid-morning things, I'm hugely unlikely to be able to ever make those, because that's for me the peak time of when I'm setting what I think my news agenda is going to be for the day, and when I'm sort of getting those stories together. And also, don't make them too long. I think that there's a sort of tendency sometimes to have, like, a 2-hour session on something or other, which is great for for some audiences, but a journalist is unlikely to take 2 hours out of their day to go and sit in on something. And I think the other thing is, you know, tell us exactly what we're going to get. I think sometimes people try and create this sort of air of mystery and say, well, you know, there's going to be a big reveal, but we're not going to tell you what it is. And, you know, that's really nice and exciting for you, but I haven't really got the time for that. I need to know. I can't go to my editor and say, I want to take an hour out to go and do that. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to go and do it anyway because it might be fun. You know, that's not really how my day job works. So I won't tell anyone. I can keep a secret, but I need to know. I need to know what to expect. You know.
So some really, really excellent advice there. And you mentioned it's very, very busy as a BBC journalist. Give us an idea, how many invitations are you getting to events at the moment?
I mean, over a week, I would say I probably get about 4 or 5 most days, I think. Martin, would you agree with that? Is that about right?
Yeah, that was what I was intrigued to hear from you, Zoe, if it was similar to me. That sounds about right. Yeah,
I mean, there'll be a flurry of them sometimes. It's not sort of, you know, regiment, but yeah, and so that's quite a lot, and obviously we can't go to most of them, so unfortunately we're more likely to not go than we are to go, I think, which is sad. But yeah, you know, the key thing for us is the practicalities. Is it going to be useful? Will it make a story? You know, how much of a sales pitch is it? A lot of the sort of things that I get are like, you know, the CEO of this company would like to come and tell you what he, and it is almost always a he, thinks about, you know, life, the universe and everything. I'm like, well, that's nice, but you know, I don't really need that. I don't really need to be broadcast at, you know.
So what's your guidance for pitching events to media? What kinds of pitches stand out to you?
They need to be very to the point, you know, what, when, where, why, how, sort of thing. Don't overwrite them, you know, be sort of almost sort of bullet point, you know, here's what you can expect to get from this session. This is why we think it's useful to you. Do your homework about the journalists that you are targeting, because nothing is more annoying than getting something that's so obviously not got anything to do with your professional area of expertise that, you know, it just becomes irritating then. I would say, you know, if it's topical, like the tracing app, for example, if it's got a topical thread to it, then you know, tell me that high up, you know. I think another thing, coming back to that thing that I said about the CEOs wanting to tell us stuff, you know, I tweeted recently because I did a story about a data hack. I can't remember which one it was now, but some data breach. And then within minutes of publishing that story, I had, you know, a dozen emails in my inbox, which were all called, you know, data breach, and then so-and-so wants to comment, you know, expert comment on data breach, and loads of them. So, you know, pick your timing. If something is breaking, then it's not going to get seen in that immediate deluge, that immediate aftermath, because so many people just swarm to try and get their clients' views heard, I suppose.
Yeah, I remember seeing your Twitter post, and I think we enjoyed sharing it internally on our own Slack channels.
Yeah, I was surprised by how popular that was, actually. I suppose it's something you don't see. It's the other side. People don't believe me when I say this. You know, everyone thinks that that they've got a unique take, and actually, most of the people haven't.
And is there a preferred channel you like to be pitched on? Is that email, Twitter, phones?
Oh, I think that's where I think relationship building is key, isn't it? It sort of depends, you know. If I've got a good relationship with somebody and I trust them, then I don't mind so much. My email is the most accessible, the most publicly available, I suppose, but it's also, as a result, the most swamped. So you know, stuff that gets in my, I mean, I've got thousands of emails in my inbox that I have never read, and I went through the other day just to sort of torture myself, and some of them go back 4 years, which is really bad, isn't it? So, you know, email is a good attempt, but not always the most reliable. I think it's probably worth trying a couple, to be honest.
What are the biggest mistakes companies make when it comes to virtual events?
The biggest mistakes companies make, I think sometimes they can be a bit too self-indulgent. You know, that I understand, of course, why do you do it? You ultimately, it's a sales pitch a lot of the time, isn't it? You're promoting your company, you're promoting a product or a brand, fine. But you know, I don't really need to sit and listen to 45 minutes of that. And I think there's an awful lot of that. There's a lot of, we've created this big stage and we're just going to advertise at you. And for me, that just is, it feels like a waste of everybody's time, actually, because, you know, I'd be interested to know, what do you hope to get from that? Do you think that we will just do a big advertorial for you? Or, you know, what is the expectation with those things? Maybe you can tell me, Katie.
I'll just chime in. With our conference, we don't allow any vendor pitches, and it's exactly for what Zoe's talking about. Like, can you imagine, like, I have to host a 24-hour conference of vendor pitches? Like, I don't have that much hair, but it would be all gone by the end of that conference. It give people really, something useful that they can learn from. And it's not a sales pitch, it's share knowledge, right? Give me something to learn that I didn't have before. And that's really what people will come back for year after year. If you do vendor pitches all the time, maybe there is a conference with that kind of purpose, but if you do vendor pitches all the time, no one's going to come back to a multi-hour commercial.
I like the analogy in PR. I think PR can sometimes be a case of the boy who cried wolf. You know, if you say something irrelevant or uninteresting too many times, no one's going to listen to you when you have something important to say. So I think, you know, particularly in this current climate, when we do have this very busy news agenda, we need to make sure that when we are inviting journalists to events and communicating, it's going to be engaging and relevant and of interest. Otherwise, it could have longer term ramifications as well.
And the other thing, sorry, if I could just say really quickly, is that, you know, we are always looking for comments, people who can give us expert comment and stuff, you know, especially people who can broadcast and are good on air. And so actually a webinar is quite a good way to suss that out. But we are also, certainly the BBC, and I think culturally as well, you know, where we are increasingly very, very big on diversity. And so that means we expect to see a selection of people. You know, I just won't even, I wouldn't even go to something that was, you know, just full of white men of a certain age, because I think in this day and age, that's just lazy. And I've come up through this, you know, where people used to say, I'm a woman working around the tech industry, right? You know, and people say, well, we asked all the women and they all said no. And I'm like, all of them? You asked all the women and every single one of them said no? That's amazing. How long did that take? You know, it's just lazy. It's not true. It might be that they're a little bit harder to find. It might be that they can't do it at the time of the school run, you know, but that's your job to think about that and to open that door to a wider selection. I don't think in 2020 there's really any excuse not to do that.
Yeah, I think that's such an important and pertinent point. So Martin, then what tips do you have for PRs and communications professionals looking to attract media to their virtual events?
I think a lot of what Zoe has touched on is absolutely spot on. You know, that timing aspect can be a huge deal, and kind of being able to fit it in the day. I think one thing that will help to get around that, help to draw people in, is if you can offer something a bit different. You know, no journalist wants to get to it at the end of a virtual event and realise that all they've got out of this is exactly what they would have got off of the press release and the WeTransfer link at the bottom that had a few assets on it. You know, that's, if you're able to offer something a bit different and a bit more than what you could normally, that will make a huge difference. I think a perfect example of that in this current climate, where most of us are, you know, kind of having to work from home and work virtually and across time zones and things like that in virtual spaces, can you get someone to speak at your event who wouldn't necessarily have been available otherwise? You know, if you were hosting an event in London, you were just thinking of having local media and local speakers, do you now have the opportunity to get someone from the US, a bit like Derek, who's willing to get up a bit earlier and come and speak? So I think that can draw people in, because if you're suddenly getting an executive from the US, for example, that will draw people in.
That's a really excellent point. So then we've talked a bit about the pitch process. So say you've been successfully pitched, you're attending a virtual event. What can the speakers do to hold your attention, Martin, during the event itself?
Goodness me. I mean, I suppose this is probably true of an event, whether it's a virtual one or a physical one. Obviously, a bit like Zoe touched upon earlier, if they've got something really important to say that isn't just eulogizing about the company, I think that will make a massive difference, of course. I think specifically when you're dealing with virtual events, you need to have that kind of that diversity of media. I think will make a difference. You shouldn't overdo it. You know, don't kind of try and show short videos if you don't need to, but if you've got extra assets that you can show while you're talking to people and they can see it on their screen, I think there are ways of making that engaging, certainly, and that can help. No one wants a presentation that is one single slide for an hour and one single voice, because that feels, you feel like you could have done this in a 10-minute phone call.
So, you mentioned some of the things that people can do during the discussion itself. What about things like demos and Q&A sessions? Do those work for you? How can they be best included in a virtual event?
From personal experience recently, I would say that these do work and can work, absolutely, but the key to them has been organisation. I've been on a couple recently where they've been really slick, really well done. They've cut to a video that's demoed something, cut some screen sharing that, for example, shows an app being used for the first time. And you're like, okay, right, I get this a bit more. I've been on others where they've had a similar number of participants on a call, all pretty much media, apart from maybe 2 or 3 PR representatives. And then at the end of the briefing, they've suddenly said, any questions? And 80 people come off mute and all try and ask a question at the same time. We've got a system here today. We've got chat set up, but you're here, Katie, as well, to ask those questions and kind of keep everyone in check. I think as long as you've got stuff like that, you're off to a pretty good start.
Fantastic. And so one question I imagine that a lot of us communications professionals are keen to hear your thoughts on. What really makes the difference between you attending an event and you actually choosing to write up a story?
Zoe hit the nail on the head earlier when she said about it having that newsworthiness. It's got to have that hook. We're not going to come along to something that is just, say, a sort of a high level, broad discussion about where a tech company or a business or an industry might be going generally. If there's something specific in there that is in the news agenda at the moment, Zoe gave a very good example of contact tracing apps, then yes, you're right, there is certainly something in that. But there's got to be that hook for us, because there is nothing worse than coming back from, you've been away from your desk, or you've been offline for 2 hours from your news desk, and then they give you a call, be like, where have you been? And you say where you've been, and then you say, oh, what, great, fantastic, when can we expect the lead on the wire? And you say, oh no, it was just a broader discussion for background. They just sort of, you hear the sigh down the phone as if to say, well, thank you for wasting everyone's time.
If I could just sort of say something quickly that I think, I don't know what you think about this, Martin. I think if you're looking to people who do it well, the games industry is brilliant at this. They're so used to live streaming games launches, console launches, often from LA or wherever. So they're used to the time zones, and they're very generally, I mean, obviously sometimes they go wrong, and but they're very slick. They're very well produced. They're lucky, of course, because they're always going to have gorgeous graphics and brilliant videos to show you. And even with or without an audience at something like E3, there's a sort of sense of excitement that they can build. But I think if I was going to put on an event myself, a virtual event, I would sort of watch a gaming one through different eyes and look at exactly how they produce those, because 9 times out of 10, I think they're really good.
Yeah, that kind of plays into my comment toward the beginning about, think about producing a television show, right? This is not a virtual webinar kind of experience. This is an engagement kind of thing. And a television show is more a production. What's on the air right now? What's going to be on air next? Who is managing who's on the air next? What is that kind of experience? Is there music? Are there graphics, right? Any kinds of things that attract and engage people, that, showing up and just having talking faces, and and that's it for a matter of, many of the virtual conferences that we're talking about are multiple hour, 3-hour to 24-hour events. And the people, I have a friend that's hosting a large virtual conference tomorrow in the voice industry, And he has one of the producers of Taylor Swift's former album working with him on the production of the event. It's really a different category of thinking of how you produce the experience versus host a virtual conference.
I think that's so interesting, and particularly interesting to hear about the Taylor Swift story as well. So Martin, Derek talked earlier about some of the benefits of virtual events for industry professionals, how they really mean that much more people are able to attend, get privileged access to some of those speakers in a way that they might not normally with a physical event. For you as a journalist, what do you see as some of the benefits of virtual events?
I think a really basic one can be just because of the situation we're in at the moment, and because you don't necessarily have to leave your home to attend these events, you've got more time to attend them. So it means if, as Zoe and I touched upon earlier, if you're getting 4 or 5 a day, although the bar is high, if you have a good day and it turns out, actually, yes, 3 or 4 of these are definitely of interest, it is possible now to maybe make it to all of them. So it's a great way of being able to be more productive with your time, I think, potentially, because you're not having also, things like the trip, it might be taking place on the other side of town or in a different town or wherever, depending on where you're based. You're taking all that travel time out of it as well. You can be in and out, just clicking a button. I think that's a huge benefit for us when pressures on our time are so huge anyway.
Zoe, is that the same for you?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's easier to attend them, time permitting, and if they're pitched right. I don't know. I mean, there really aren't very many that I would attend, but I also think, think carefully about what it is you want to tell journalists. We're a different audience to, your peers or your investors, and sometimes, and I've had some really honest chats with PRs where I have said exactly this: what exactly are you hoping to get from me going along? Because it doesn't sound to me like this is a journalist story. Actually, this sounds like you want to have a chat with your investors about how well your company is doing. Do you want me to be there? And sometimes I'm like, oh, actually, you're right, there isn't really a story at the moment. Well, there you go then. But really think about people. I think there's a pressure, isn't there, to have the press there. It's nice to have the press there. We like to be there. It's nice to be able to say if you have a big name organization, I suppose it's good PR and all of that. But think about what exactly it is that you're offering those journalists and what you're hoping to get in return, because you might find that actually this isn't the journalist event that you think it is. It's something else. It's something designed for a different audience. And one thing that I think Martin mentioned earlier, and I get too, is like, it's really annoying when you go along to something and then they go, oh, by the way, this is just background chat, and you're like, oh, right, okay, well, we could do that on the phone anytime, couldn't we? I don't have to sit here for an hour for that.
Yeah, but no, that's such an important point. So Derek, we've talked a lot about the pitch process, getting media to attend. I know you talked a little bit earlier about the sort of 60-30 rule. I mean, how long would you say that companies need to prepare for industry events, right through from that idea generation stage to the actual event itself?
Yeah, it's certainly for us, it's a year-long process, and depending on the size of the conference, who you're trying to attract, how you're trying to organize it, similar to physical conferences, we start with figuring out what does our program need to look like. For keynote speakers, that we have multiple keynotes throughout the 24 hours of our event, their schedules are tight. They're hard to get, even if it's a virtual conference and they don't have to travel. So they're some of the people that we try and lock down earliest. Like, I know it's 10 months away, but I want to see if you have availability at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on this day to participate with us. And the other thing is the call for speakers. So we went out with our call for speakers. So our big event is November 12th this year. Our call for speakers went out, I want to say, in mid-February or early March. So we're already promoting, we're going to have this conference, it's going to be back, we need the speakers. That helps us develop the program and agenda. And our plan is by July 1st, we announce who the speakers are going to be, and then by usually the end of the summer, we publish the schedule available to everyone. So we need a long time to plan and also a long time to promote. The other thing that I'll tell you from just a planning perspective that a lot of people don't recognize, or maybe it's quite similar to physical events, is we start our very vocal promotional timeline for promotional timing for the event, starting at the beginning of July for a November event. So we are constantly out offering something that talks about the conference, why to attend, register, engage your team, what have you, for many months. And out of the 40,000 people that registered to participate in this conference, 20,000 of those people registered in the last week and a half.
Wow.
Right? It's virtual. They don't need to travel. It's free. They didn't need to get budget, right? They've heard about it since July, right? Or they know about it because of the previous year. But year after year, we've done this 5 years, and we know and we can track. We're getting 100 registrations a day in July. We're getting 150 to 180 in August. By September, we're getting 250 to 300 registrations. October, we're getting thousands a day. In the last week, we're getting 3,000, 4,000 a day sometimes, right? So it really, because of the virtual nature of these events and no one having to plan or travel, your registrations can come at the very last minute. So don't freak out if you're like, oh my gosh, we're planning this big thing and no one's registering. Like, they don't need to register long ahead of time. So I think that's key. And then I think that the other thing that's vitally important, and a lot of people leave off the table, is say you attract 2,000 people to your conference, or 10,000 people, or whatever the number is. What are you doing with those people afterwards? So from an all-day DevOps perspective, we have the conference day of. We are live blogging during the conference on the different sessions and posting those blogs to our site. Then we are continuously posting blogs afterwards. We have the Slack workspace where people are sharing information in conferences. We participate in podcasts, along the way after the conference, talking about the sessions. We introduce speakers at other conferences to other communities. We have live social interviews with them, and we publish a book each year about sessions that have gone on in the conference. And the books and the blogs are vitally important because, as I mentioned before, we don't allow vendor pitches. So no stories come into this conference of like, we had a problem and we knew it was a challenge, so we bought some product solution and everything was miraculous after that, right? It's real, authentic conversations. Here's what we're doing. We have a couple of problems. We solved a couple of things. We still have to solve a couple of things. This went wrong along the way. We're still trying to figure that out and get that other team on board. It's like very authentic stuff, but it's like, yeah, that's actually the life that I'm living, and I want to learn from these lessons. But you have to think about, how do you take the value of content that you're creating that day and utilize it over time to keep people engaged? And you kind of have to think, we think about it in concert terms. Imagine a big Lollapalooza event, right? And 50,000, 100,000 people gather for this massive concert once a year. And then they leave and they go back home, they go on to their normal lives. Do they come back the next year? Or is there a roaming concert tour around the world in local areas where you're promoting the musicians and the experience throughout the year? And how do you kind of maintain that, drumbeat of information or value to the community that you serve? So I think it's more about thinking of that longer term experience in your planning than anything else.
And Jenny, then how does that line up from a PR perspective when we're talking about dedicated media events like roundtables and press conferences?
Yeah, I think echo a lot of what Derek said actually still resonates very much for the press event scenario. So you've very much got to think about the before, during and after. And the lead time should be similar to that of a physical event. So even slightly longer in particular if you're not familiar with the tech setup and how the webinar is going to work, or the chat function, or what Slack support you might have in addition to have those ongoing conversations. So you need to think about the outline, the logistics, the scripting, and even more time for addressing, say, the visual aspect, because that will be very, very important. Ask yourself, how will you market it or pitch it? What's your hook? How will
Jenny might have just broken up for a moment there. I know it's
work on, how will it work on the day? How to make it a better experience for me?
Are you back with us, Jenny?
I am. Can you hear me now?
all good. Sorry, we just missed the end of that, but I think some really interesting points that you raised with both you and Derek, talking about how events are so much more than just the day itself, and how there's this real opportunity to drive visibility of your brand in the run up and afterwards as well. So, I mean, Jenny, what advice would you give for companies to amplify their events?
So I think it's really useful to take a few steps back here and think about who's really going to be interested in this event's content. Is it your current customers, your prospects, or is it solely media? Map out this core audience, think about who they are, what are their contact details, are they in your network or in your team's network, and think about how best to engage with them and how to invite them. It sounds really simple, but I think echo everything Martin and Zoe talked about. Is make your invite really compelling and concise, make it clear what's going to be of interest and why, and what they will gain from it. And I think Derek was also talking about, having that clarity in your social and marketing plan before any invites even go out is vital. So are you going to have snippets of themes or visuals or data that you can promote socially in order to market the event? Have this content ready and approved and scheduled to go out in the build up to your event and beyond. Measurement's also key. So regularly check in to see what content is working, when, how, so that you can learn and adapt your amplification as you go. Also very important, before you've even started the event, is what output's going to come from it following it. So how can you keep people engaged? So is it going to be a series of blogs, a white paper, a recording? And when exactly can you share that? If it's just a media event, what's the expected output from the client's perspective? And how can you make sure that actually happens and support that? So once you've started the comms before or during the event, how will you continue this? So what future events or content can you share to keep this audience engaged on a longer term basis?
There's some really, really excellent points there about that amplification and engagement as well. And what advice then do you have for companies when it comes to the day itself?
So it's interesting to hear Martin talk about it being, that requirement for more than just a press release. So really make sure that you're encouraging dialogue both before and during that. Can the journalists actually answer questions in advance? You can make sure that you're really going to give them the best impact from that particular event. And on a tactical level, think creatively about how else to enhance that experience. So if this would have traditionally have been a breakfast event, can you send them some breakfast in advance, or some mocktails or something in the evening? Think about how you can really replicate that physical event. So for example, one of the things we've been doing to help our clients engage with their prospect customers is working with a restaurant group to create virtual cook-alongs with Michelin-starred chefs. It's followed then by an industry discussion. So it's a really good opportunity to engage and recreate what would have been a physical event previously into something more virtual, but still very much engaged.
Definitely. It's so important, I think, to create something that can be really experiential, as a number of you have touched upon. And so lastly then, Jenny, what advice would you give for companies thinking about hosting a virtual event?
I think really think very hard about whether an event is the right mechanism for you and for this particular focus that you've got in mind. So ensure you've got clear takeaways for the attendees, and make sure your event and the content it produces really work hard for you. So through effective promotion, engagement throughout the actual event, and of course the follow-up. It's not just about the event itself. It's everything else that you wrap around it, which I think, you know, Derek in particular has touched on quite a lot.
And Derek, any last words from you on your advice for companies thinking about hosting a virtual event?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, we talked about just before we went live this morning, which is have a backup. You are online, the internet can go down. We talked about there were two instances before our first conference 5 years ago. One, 6 days before the event, the entire internet on the East Coast of the United States went down for about 3 hours. That would have been disastrous if that was the day of our conference. And it also glitched out for about 2 seconds before we were going, 5 minutes before we were going live, the day of the first conference. So again, think about the production, as Jenny was just saying.
Or just experiencing as well, Derek. I'm blaming the storm.
Yeah.
London.
So it's, you know, do you have a backup location? If things go, you know, if you're from your office or from home, do you have a backup? If you're, you know, if Katie's running this and Katie's internet drops, what happens is that backup. So really have your contingency plan mapped out. If Katie's organizing the speakers and she's offline because there's a storm coming through her neighborhood, you know, then who is taking over for Katie in that regard? So you really have to think about the production and how it works and what can go wrong as a result. The other thing that I'll mention is technology is a secondary decision. There are lots of technologies, lots of platforms that you can use, but it's more, as Zoe was talking about earlier, what is the experience that you're trying to deliver? And figure that out, and then figure out the technology that comes along with helping you on that. And the other thing, just as we're doing this morning here, make sure that it's live. There is a big difference between I'm taking my time to talk to all of you live, chat in the chat room, to be here live. It would be a completely different experience for your attendees if I was recorded during this. We can't have the interaction, we can't have the live back and forth. It's just not as authentic and not real. And you know, someone like Zoe or Martin are like, this is recorded, I could watch this anytime. Why did I have to show up at, you know, 9 a.m. or 2 p.m. to watch this recorded session that was recorded 3 weeks ago? You could have sent me this ahead of time and I could have kept it under embargo. So live really makes a difference. I know it's more of a production hassle, but I think it makes the quality of the event much better in that regard.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much to our panelists. So I can see that the Q&A has been busy. So I'd now like to open up the floor to questions. If you do have any questions, please do type those in the box now. So question start with you, Martin. What's the best virtual event you've ever attended?
Oh wow. That's a good question. I'm trying to think. I suppose you probably could class it as an event. Somebody, in light of being unable to have people physically try out a new product they were launching, sent out a handful of VR headsets for people to demo the product virtually at home, as it were, so you could see it in your house, and there were their assets linked to that. So that was quite impressive, because that felt a little bit like thinking outside the box. They sent it to everyone sort of a week in advance before an embargo, so you had time over that week to get it prepped and things like that. So that was quite a good example, I thought.
And Derek, with everyone now living much of their life digitally, how can we make the proposition of a virtual event exciting? A lot of people are getting Zoom fatigue. What advice do you have there?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different things. One is the interactivity, the hallway track is that we've talked about before. You know, are there opportunities to use Zoom or whatever platform that you're using for open spaces? So something that is not particularly on the agenda, we're going to take a group of people that wants to talk about, you know, how to do PR promotion in this room. Go here during this time. You can all meet here, have this conversation. So you're creating that forum. It doesn't all have to be structured. You know, give people an opportunity to share. Don't create velvet ropes. You can attend if or by attending, certain groups get exclusive access to certain people. Obviously, for press, you might want that for your executive team to have those kind of more exclusive interactions. But I think part of the virtual community it just allows you access to anyone. And I think that's part of how to better engage, through the conference platform itself.
And question.
Katie, I'll just add in there as well that anything that encourages participation, so whether it's like the Slack channel and hallway stream that Derek mentioned, but also Q&As or polls, something that actually makes people have to pay attention rather than say multitasking and doing a million other things at the same time, is also participating in a virtual event.
And question for Zoe, would you prefer a special stream in a virtual event for journalists alone? And would you prefer a group briefing or a one-to-one briefing?
I think all journalists really like a one-to-one briefing, don't we? Because then we can sort of ask our questions and not get them nicked by other journalists, because we're a competitive bunch. One thing that does occur to me actually, and this happens more often than you'd think, is if you're running an event and you're inviting journalists, then there can't be any elephants in the room. So sometimes, it happens more than you'd think. People will invite me to something and I'll be interested in going because the company's in the news, or because, maybe there's a bit of controversy about what they're working on. Let's take, for example, facial recognition, right? I get invited to something about facial recognition. And I think, do you know what? Actually, that's really interesting because there's a lot of controversy around it. I'd be interested to know what they think about other countries changing the rules and blah, 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 And then they say, oh, no, we're not going to talk about any of that. And you're like, well, that's what everybody wants to talk about. There's no point in you hosting this event and then not letting us talk about the one thing that everybody wants to know. And I think if you're going to open the door like that, then you have to be prepared that people are going to, want to talk to you about the thing that they're hearing about at the time. Not just nosy journalists like me, but generally that's going to be something you're going to have to face, I think.
And I think from a PR perspective as well, a lot of that comes down to preparing your speakers, having that media training, preempting what those questions are going to be so that you know how to address them in the right way and not lose your target audience. Martin, is that the same for you? Do you also prefer the one-to-one streams?
Yes, definitely. As Zoe says, it's all about, you want your own exclusive quotes. We're PAs, because we're not consumer facing, we're about showing our value to our customers, who are people like the BBC and other broadcasters and other major news organisations. So we have to show our value by constantly putting out big exclusives, things that no one else have got.
And Derek, question for you. What factors do you need to bear in mind when you are choosing the platform to host your virtual event on?
Yeah, so as I said, this is probably the first question people ask me all the time, and it's not of the most importance when you're hosting it, but it's really thinking about the experience that you want to give. Do you want people on video? Are you going to have people live as part of the program? Are they going to be sharing slides? Are they going to be sharing video? Are they going to be sharing code? How many people are going to be talking at once? You have to look at the production value of this. Also, in our conference, it's a very large scale conference with, we have 150 speakers coming through our production studios in a 24-hour period. We have a green room, we have backup rooms, we have social media teams that are tracking what are people saying on LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook. We have people monitoring our Slack workspace to figure out, are people behaving? Are they following the code of conduct? If they're not, are we booting people out of that? I think it's more about, think about the experiences that you want. And then the platform will be more, the idea of which platform will get you there will be more clear. So, for us in our conference, we want to reach as many people as possible. We happen to use Zoom. You could use a number of other things. Our Zoom conferences, like this kind of interface, is broadcast out to YouTube. because almost everyone has access to YouTube. It also scales better than any other platform on the planet for broadcast. So just thinking about, how many people do you want to reach? If you want to reach 200 people, a paid platform may make sense. When you're reaching 40,000 people, you might not have the budget to have a, on demand, on 24 or WebEx or some of these other solutions. If you have to pay for 40,000 users for a long period of time, and you want persistence, of the video recordings over time, how many recordings are you making? Can you afford the cloud storage of those videos and all of that? So I think it's really about determining the experience that you're trying to deliver and build and produce and operate during the conference, and then going to the vendor saying, okay, I have my checklist. Do you guys meet that? Because it will be, your requirements for your conference will be much different than my requirements for trying to figure out 40,000 people at scale, right?
And so just one last question before we wrap up for everyone. When we reach a post-COVID situation, would you want to go back to in-person conferences, or do you think virtual events are the way forwards? Jenny, perhaps you'd like to start.
Yeah, I think in all honesty, I think it's going to be a long time before we go back to, say, the normal MWCs or CESs of the world, halls filled with people, all in very close proximity. And I think it's an exciting time to see more events like All Day DevOps coming to the forefront, and people actually trying something a bit different, something they might have thought about doing before but not been sure how to do it, or if it was right for the market. So possibly in 2 years we might get back to the maybe half the amount of physical events that there were. I think virtual is definitely going to be here to stay for a long time.
Yeah, I'll just comment, the whole reason why we started All Day DevOps in the first place was inclusivity. And even if tomorrow we have a COVID vaccine, we can all go out into public, those 3 people from Lloyd's of London are still attending that physical conference, and there's still 600 people back at the office that can't, right? Those people need access to information as well. So I am 100% looking forward to the next physical conference I can go to, but I don't think that's going to diminish the value of the virtual experience that we've been creating for 5 years now.
I think that's a really nice note to end on. So virtual events are here to stay. So on that note, I'll say huge thank you to our brilliant panelists, Derek Weeks, Zoe Kleinman, Martin Landy, and Jenny Mowat. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to speak to us. As a reminder, we'll be sharing the recording and a white paper with you shortly afterwards. So please do keep your eyes peeled for that, and our contact details are there. Please do get in touch with Babel. If you had any questions that we didn't get a chance to answer during this call, please also send them our way. And if you'd like to speak to us about how to plan your own virtual event, we would love to speak to you. So please do get in touch. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.